There's a particular kind of emotional aftershock that doesn't arrive through confrontation, but through silence. Not the silence that happens during distance, but the silence that follows it, when the story has already ended externally, yet continues internally, without witnesses. In that space, what often surfaces is not just memory, but reinterpretation. The mind begins to revisit past interactions with a different emotional temperature. What once felt manageable, even justified, starts to look more exposed under the light of separation. Actions that were once dismissed or rationalized begin to carry unintended weight, and the self, now without distraction or relational momentum, is left alone with its own narrative. For someone who tends to struggle with emotional closeness or intensity, this internal space can become especially complex, not because they lack feeling, but because feeling often arrives in layers rather than immediacy. In the moment, emotional activation can trigger distancing responses, a need to regain equilibrium, a retreat into control, or a quiet shutdown of vulnerability. But later, when the external triggers are gone, those same emotions don't disappear. They reorganize. They return as reflection. And reflection has a different texture than reaction. Reaction is fast, protective, and situational. Reflection is slow, accumulative, and often more honest than the moment itself allows. It doesn't need to defend as urgently. It doesn't need to maintain a position. So it can feel more penetrating. This is where the mind often begins to revisit the presence of the other person, not as an active relationship, but as a felt absence. And absence has its own language. It doesn't argue or demand. It simply reveals contrast. What becomes noticeable in that contrast is not just what happened, but what was consistently present over time. Patience, emotional availability, steadiness, or attempts at understanding. These qualities, when no longer actively interacting with resistance, can take on a sharper clarity. Not because they were invisible before, but because they are no longer being filtered through the same defensive responses. However, it's important to understand something essential here. This process is not as linear or as universally dramatic as it is often portrayed. Emotional processing varies widely between individuals. Some people move through reflection quickly, some slowly, and some oscillate between insight and avoidance for a long time. What matters is not a dramatic awakening, but the gradual integration of experience. In many cases, what emerges after relational distance is not simply regret, but complexity. The recognition that closeness and discomfort were happening simultaneously, that care and overwhelm were coexisting, that desire for connection and fear of dependence were intertwined rather than separate states. Human emotional systems rarely operate in clean binaries. They are layered, often contradictory, and shaped by earlier experiences that influence how safety and intimacy are perceived. So when someone revisits a past relationship, they are not just evaluating the other person. They are also encountering their own internal patterns more clearly. This is where things can become emotionally dense, because it is one thing to understand a relationship while inside it, and another to understand it when the urgency has faded and only meaning remains. Now, regarding the idea of shame that can arise in hindsight, it is worth approaching carefully. Shame does not always appear as a single, overwhelming emotion. It often arrives indirectly, through self-questioning, through reinterpretation of past choices, through awareness of missed opportunities for different responses. But even then, it is rarely just about one person or one relationship. It is usually tied to broader self-perception, how someone understands their own capacity for intimacy, communication, or emotional presence. When someone recognizes that a connection mattered more than they fully acknowledged at the time, the discomfort is not only about loss, it is also about mismatch between intention and impact, between how they saw themselves acting in the moment and how those actions may be understood later. But here is a crucial nuance. The mind naturally seeks coherence. When something ends without resolution, it tries to construct meaning that reduces uncertainty. Sometimes that meaning leans towards self-criticism, sometimes toward external explanation, sometimes toward a mix of both. None of these interpretations are fixed truths. They are attempts to stabilize emotional ambiguity. The idea that you didn't make a scene, so there was nowhere to place the discomfort, can be understood in a more psychological sense, rather than a literal or moral one. In many relational dynamics, open conflict serves as a container for emotion. It externalizes tension. It gives form to internal states. When conflict is absent, there is less external structure for unresolved emotion to attach itself to, which can lead to more internal processing instead. However, this does not mean that silence causes shame, or that lack of confrontation intensifies regret in a direct or universal way. Rather, it means that different relational endings create different psychological conditions for reflection. Some endings are loud and externally processed. Others are quiet and internally processed. Neither is inherently more painful or more meaningful. They are simply different pathways. In quieter endings, the mind may spend more time reconstructing the relationship internally because there was no final external closure. That reconstruction can include revisiting moments of connection, misunderstanding, distance, or care. But it also includes the self being re-examined through memory, and memory is not a neutral archive. It is an active system that reorganizes experience based on present emotional state. This is why past interactions can feel different over time, not because the events themselves changed, but because the lens through which they are viewed has shifted. Another important layer is that humans often underestimate how much internal conflict exists beneath outward behavior. Someone may appear distant in one moment and deeply engaged in another, not because one state is true and the other is false, but because emotional systems fluctuate based on perceived safety, stress, familiarity, and relational history. This fluctuation can create confusion for both sides of a relationship if it is not openly understood. When distance becomes the primary coping mechanism in moments of emotional intensity, it can prevent immediate expression, but increase later reflection, not necessarily as punishment, but as delayed integration. The emotional system revisits what it could not fully process in real time. At the same time, it is essential not to turn this into a fixed narrative of inevitability or emotional fate. People are not locked into static patterns of relating. Awareness changes behavior. New experiences reshape old responses. Emotional growth is not linear, but it is real. So when looking at the aftermath of a relationship, what is often more accurate than "they felt nothing then and everything later" is something more nuanced. Different emotional layers become accessible at different times. Immediate reactions prioritize regulation and protection. Later reflection allows for broader understanding and sometimes deeper emotional contact with what was experienced. This is not about assigning blame or constructing a moral arc of realization. It is about recognizing how complex timing is in emotional life. And perhaps the most grounded way to understand all of this is to step away from the idea of emotional certainty altogether. Relationships do not end in perfectly resolved emotional states. They end in transitions. Some feelings are fully processed, some remain partially understood, some evolve over time, and some remain ambiguous without ever becoming fully clear. What makes human connection so intricate is that it never exists as a single, unified experience shared equally between two people. It exists as two internal worlds brushing against each other, each interpreting the same moments through completely different emotional architectures. Timing enters like an invisible architect in the background. The right emotional presence at the wrong moment can still feel wrong. The wrong emotional expression at the right moment can still feel overwhelming. Timing determines whether connection feels like safety or pressure, expansion or contraction, and yet timing is rarely something either person consciously controls. It unfolds through life circumstances, personal growth stages, and unseen emotional cycles. Emotional readiness sits underneath all of it. Readiness is not the same as willingness. Someone can want connection deeply and still not be ready to sustain it in a healthy way. Readiness involves integration, the ability to stay present when vulnerability is activated, rather than retreating into defense, control, or avoidance. It is often shaped long before a relationship ever begins, formed through earlier experiences that taught the nervous system what closeness feels like. When you place all of these layers together, connection stops looking like a simple story of "they felt it" or "they didn't." It becomes a constantly shifting overlap of internal states, where moments of alignment and misalignment coexist within the same relationship. In reality, both people are usually moving through their own internal processes at different speeds. One might be reaching clarity while the other is still in defense, One might be withdrawing while still caring, while the other might be reaching out while feeling increasingly unseen. These are not contradictions in character, but differences in timing and emotional processing. And this is where the idea of one thread in a larger weave becomes especially important, because no single perspective can contain the entire truth of a connection. Each person holds only their side of perception, shaped by what they felt, what they noticed, what they were capable of interpreting, and what they were ready to understand. Even shared moments are split through subjective experience. What felt like deep connection to one person may have felt like uncertainty to another. What felt like emotional consistency to one may have felt like emotional pressure to the other. These differences do not invalidate either experience. They simply reveal that experience itself is relationally constructed, not objectively identical. Over time, the mind may try to resolve this complexity by choosing a dominant narrative. It might elevate certain memories and diminish others to create emotional closure. But closure is often more about reducing internal tension than capturing full truth. The deeper reality remains layered and unresolved in a different sense, not because it is painful, but because it is multidimensional. Seen this way, connection becomes less about outcomes and more about intersections. Moments where two internal worlds briefly align in understanding, affection, curiosity, or care. Some of those intersections deepen and stabilize. Others pass through each other and dissolve as conditions change. And when those intersections end, what remains is not a single definitive meaning, but a mosaic of experiences that each person continues to interpret in their own evolving way. So instead of asking who realized what or who understood too late, the more accurate lens is to recognize that every connection is an exchange between two evolving systems, each doing its best within its own limits of perception, capacity, timing, and readiness. And within that understanding, no single story ever holds the entire sky. In that sense, the quiet aftermath of a relationship is not a courtroom where meaning is finally assigned. It is more like a slow unfolding of understanding, where each person continues to interpret their experience in the context of who they are becoming. And sometimes the deepest insight is not about what was lost, but about how differently two people can live through the same connection and still walk away with entirely different internal realities. You just walked away quietly, with a kind of composure that said more about your self-respect than anything they showed during the whole relationship. Being outclassed in dignity by the very person they hurt is not a minor wound in the avoidant mind. It lingers. It burns quietly beneath the surface, and it refuses to be filed away and forgotten. Now let's talk about the anger, because it's real, and you need to understand exactly where it comes from so you don't mistake it for proof that your silence was somehow the wrong move. The avoidant is angry at you. In most cases, genuinely and irrationally so, and specifically directed at you. And that irrationality is exactly what makes it so telling. They're angry because you changed the rules. Not rules either of you ever agreed on out loud, but rules the avoidant quietly set through their own behavior, then unconsciously expected you to keep following forever. The rule that you'd always be available. The rule that your investment would always outweigh theirs. The rule that the whole dynamic would keep running in a way that protected their emotional safety while keeping their sense of control intact. Your silence shattered every single one of those unspoken rules at once. And that anger is simply the avoidant's first line of defense against watching a structure they secretly depended on, one built entirely on your willingness to keep showing up, collapse overnight. I want to stress this clearly. The anger doesn't make logical sense, and on some level, the avoidant knows that, which is exactly why it's so uncomfortable for them to sit with. They can't explain the anger without exposing the entitlement hiding underneath it. They can't admit that your choice to protect yourself upset them without also admitting they assumed you never would. And admitting that means admitting they were taking you for granted, which clashes badly with how they see themselves, as someone fair, self-aware, emotionally evolved. So that anger has nowhere clean to go. It can't be aimed at you directly because there's no real justification. You simply stopped reaching out, a decision that belongs entirely to you and needs no explanation to anyone. It can't be turned fully inward either, because that kind of self-honesty requires more emotional readiness than the avoidant currently has access to. So it just sits there, uncomfortable, overheated, quietly humiliating, another sign that your silence has shaken something far deeper than they expected it to. Beneath both the shame and the anger, and this part matters most for understanding what your silence has really set into motion, is something far softer. Something the avoidant will fight hard not to face, even privately, even completely alone, even in those unguarded moments when their usual defenses go quiet. Grief. Real, specific, unexpectedly deep grief for what they had with you, and for everything their own patterns ended up costing them. An avoidant's relationship with grief is one of the most tangled parts of their entire emotional makeup, because grieving requires admitting loss, and admitting loss requires admitting value, admitting that something mattered enough that its absence actually hurts. And that kind of admission goes directly against the self-sufficient image they've spent years constructing. Admitting that they valued you, that they actually needed the connection, that what they let slip away through withdrawal and emotional distance wasn't some replaceable, casual thing, but something truly irreplaceable. Your silence brings that grief right to the surface. Not because silence was ever meant as a manipulation to force that reaction. I want to be very clear about that, but because silence takes away every distraction that let them avoid facing it in the first place. As long as you kept reaching out, the avoidant could stay busy managing the situation, deciding how much distance to keep, constantly and quietly tracking your emotional state and adjusting their own position around it. Your silence stops all of that. There's nothing left to manage, nothing left to calculate, nothing left to watch. There's only the empty space where you used to be. And in that empty space, with nothing left to distract them, the grief finally makes its way through. Now let's talk about what the avoidant actually does with all of it, the embarrassment, the anger, the grief, the unsettling realization that they need you in ways they never planned for. Because the pattern that follows is fairly predictable, and understanding it will help you move forward with a lot more clarity. The avoidant's very first instinct is almost always to pull even further away. That might sound backwards, but psychologically it makes complete sense. When their internal world becomes too loud, too intense to comfortably push down, their automatic response is to lean harder into whatever has offered them relief before, more distance, more independence, more of that outward appearance of not needing anyone. From the outside, this can look like they've completely moved on, like your silence changed nothing, like they're perfectly fine, unaffected by your absence. I want you to understand that this appearance is one of the least trustworthy signals in human behavior. Doubling down on distance isn't what someone does when they feel nothing. It's what someone does when they feel far too much and only have one tool for handling it. An avoidant who's retreating even further into distance is actually in the most exhausting, most effortful stage of reacting to your silence. They're working overtime to hold together a calm exterior, while everything underneath is working just as hard to break that composure apart. The second stage, which usually shows up after some stretch of time, depending on the person and how deep the connection between you actually ran, is what I'd call a period of unwilling reflection. No matter how strong someone's defenses are, they can't hold indefinitely against a genuine loss. And so the avoidant starts to think about you, usually in the quietest, least guarded moments, early mornings, late nights, in the middle of some mundane task that doesn't fully occupy their mind, and they start to think about you with a kind of honesty their more defended hours never allow. They remember specific moments, the feel of certain conversations, how you made them feel when their walls were finally down and the connection felt real and unguarded. They remember the things you did that no one else ever did for them, the way you understood them in a way no one else ever quite managed, the particular experience of being truly known by you, something they've been pretending mattered less than it actually did. And they start to reckon with what they did with all of that, what their patterns actually cost them, what the constant push and pull, the withdrawal, the emotional unavailability ultimately led to, not in some detached theoretical sense, but in the raw, unavoidable way that comes from actually holding the weight of your own choices and realizing it's heavier than you expected. This is the humbling moment, not a performance for your benefit, not a calculated move to lure you back, but a real, private, often completely silent experience of being brought down to earth by the sheer weight of their own decisions and everything they've lost because of them. Now, I want to speak directly to you because I've spent a lot of time inside the avoidance experience, and I don't want to leave you stuck there with them. I want to bring the focus back to you, to what your silence actually means for your own life, separate from whatever it's stirring up in them. Your silence was never a weapon, I know some people will try to frame it that way, as some calculated power move, a strategic withdrawal meant to trigger exactly the reaction I just described, and maybe for some people that's genuinely how it starts. But the kind of silence I'm talking about here, the kind that actually humbles an avoidant, that produces real embarrassment, real anger, real grief, real involuntary reflection, that silence never comes from strategy. It comes from exhaustion, from the deep, bone-level tiredness of someone who has poured everything into a dynamic that only ever took. It comes from that moment of complete clarity when the cost of continuing finally outweighs whatever hope was keeping you there. That moment isn't a tactic, it's a turning point. It's the exact moment you stopped shaping your life around their unavailability and started shaping it around your own worth instead. And what your silence communicates, to them, to the world, and most importantly to yourself, is something no argument, no ultimatum, no confrontation could ever express with the same weight. It says you know your own value, not as some idea you're trying to convince yourself of, not as an affirmation you repeat until it feels true, but as a lived, embodied, non-negotiable fact. You are simply no longer willing to shrink for the comfort of someone who wasn't willing to show up fully for you. The avoidant is embarrassed, angry, and quietly, privately humbled by your silence. And somewhere underneath all of that, in the most honest, unguarded part of themselves, they're also doing something that might genuinely surprise you. They're respecting you more than they've respected almost anyone in a long time, maybe more than they even realized they were capable of respecting someone in a romantic connection. Because avoidance respects self-possession above nearly everything else. It's the one trait they've built their entire identity around, and you just demonstrated it more completely and more consistently than they ever managed throughout your entire relationship. They pulled away loudly, through mixed signals, through walls going up and down and up again. You pulled away in silence, clean, complete, and fully sure of yourself. That's not something they'll simply forget. That's not something they'll easily find in someone else. And it's not something that leaves their inner world untouched, no matter how unaffected they might look on the outside. You didn't fight for their attention. You didn't chase. You didn't turn your pain into a weapon or your need into a plea. There is a kind of ending that doesn't arrive with explanation. It doesn't arrive with negotiation or repetition or emotional punctuation marks that try to make sense of what went wrong. It arrives in something far simpler and far more absolute: absence. Not the dramatic absence that seeks attention, but the quiet one that refuses to participate further. When someone stops in that way, it is rarely an impulsive act. More often, it is the result of accumulated recognition, a slow internal accounting of effort, understanding, misalignment, emotional return, and self-abandonment. At some point, the internal scale tips not because of a single event, but because the pattern becomes undeniable. And once something is seen clearly enough, it no longer requires debate. It only requires action. So the stopping is not loud, it is not performative, it does not seek to prove anything. It simply removes itself from a dynamic that no longer makes sense to continue. And that is where its power lies. Because most relational communication depends on participation. Words, explanations, emotional gestures, clarifications, attempts to be understood, all of these exist inside the shared space between two people. But when one person withdraws from that space entirely, the entire structure changes. There is no longer a conversation to interpret. There is no longer a rhythm to respond to. There is only the echo of what used to exist. That echo is often where meaning begins to reorganize. In the absence of ongoing interaction, the mind of the other person is left to reconstruct the shape of what happened. And reconstruction is always different from real-time experience. In real time, emotions are filtered through immediacy, defense, distraction, and self-protection. But in hindsight, those filters loosen. The mind starts to replay not only events, but patterns. Not only words, but tone. Not only moments, but what those moments collectively represented. This is where silence begins to speak its own language. It is not silence as emptiness. It is silence as structure. It frames everything that came before it. It turns small details into signals. It turns inconsistencies into questions. It turns familiarity into something that now has no ongoing confirmation. But perhaps the most significant shift is internal rather than relational. Because when someone who once stayed, explained, tried, adjusted, and emotionally engaged finally stops, it also marks a turning point in their relationship with themselves. The stopping is not only about the other person, it is about reclaiming internal coherence. It is about no longer acting against one's own emotional reality for the sake of maintaining connection. And that is why it carries such weight. Not because it is meant to punish, and not because it is meant to provoke realization, but because it reflects a boundary that has finally become stronger than attachment. From the outside, this can be misread as indifference, but indifference is emotionally empty. This kind of stopping is not empty. It is full of awareness, full of processing, full of decisions that have already been made internally long before anything changes externally. That is why it feels different to the person on the receiving end. They are not reacting to a sudden emotional shift. They are encountering the final visible outcome of a long invisible process. And in that encounter, something subtle often happens. The narrative can no longer rely on the other person's participation to stay coherent. The usual patterns of repair, reassurance, or re-engagement are no longer available. So the mind is left with only interpretation. Interpretation fills silence with meaning. Sometimes accurate, sometimes distorted, always incomplete. But regardless of what meaning is constructed afterward, the stopping itself remains fixed. It does not adjust. It does not soften itself to be more digestible. It does not return to clarify what has already been clarified through action, because at that stage, the action is the message. And this is where the paradox emerges. The more unnecessary words would have been, the more powerful their absence becomes. Because words can be debated, words can be reinterpreted, words can be argued against. But consistent absence cannot be negotiated in the same way. It is simply a new condition, a condition that says, the previous version of engagement no longer exists. For the person who made that decision, this can feel strangely calm and heavy at the same time. Calm, because internal conflict has ended. Heavy, because endings still carry emotional residue even when they are chosen. But underneath both is something quieter, alignment. The sense that behavior finally matches internal truth. That alignment is what gives the stopping its authority. Not authority over the other person, but authority over internal contradiction. The moment someone stops overriding their own perception in order to maintain connection, something stabilizes. Self-respect stops being an idea and becomes structure, and that is why it lands so strongly in the relational field. Because what was once dynamic, responsive, and emotionally accessible has now become self-contained, not as a wall built in reaction, but as a boundary formed through clarity. In that sense, stopping is not an ending designed to send a message. It is the natural outcome of a point where continuation would require self-erasure. And once someone recognizes that cost clearly enough, silence is no longer a tactic. It becomes truth expressed without language.